Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to be with you for another quiet hour of reason. Tell me, is there tea beside you, perhaps lamplight nearby? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when the mind grows still and truth becomes visible. Do subscribe so these evenings find you without fail. Now, settle in. For as the world's most careful observer believed, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, link in the description below. Chapter 1. The Esteemed Chambers of Lincoln's Inn. There are mornings in London when the city seems to hold its breath, when the familiar fog has thinned to a pale gauze, and the streets below Baker Street are quiet enough that one may hear the distant rumble of a cart upon the cobbles, and fancy oneself transported to some calmer century. It was upon one such morning, in the late autumn of a year I shall not particularize further than to say that Holmes had lately concluded his celebrated investigation into the Whitmore forgeries, and was, by his own admission, at something of a loose end. I had called upon my friend at 9:30, having spent the preceding evening at my club in a state of comfortable idleness. I found him in his customary chair by the cold hearth, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, in the attitude of concentrated repose which I had long since learned to distinguish from genuine sleep. A scatter of newspapers lay about the room, in the magnificent disorder he preferred, and upon the deal table beside him stood the remains of a breakfast Mrs. Hudson had evidently coaxed him to begin, and which he had declined to finish. "Watson," said he without opening his eyes, "you have come on foot from Paddington, and you have stopped somewhere along the way to read a newspaper, the Morning Post, I should think, given the ink upon your right forefinger. The agony column again." "The leader article, as it happens," I replied, removing my coat and settling into the opposite chair. "You might have asked rather than inferred. Inference is quicker and more reliable." He opened his eyes at last and fixed me with a gaze of faint amusement. "I am glad you have come. I've been staring at the ceiling for 2 hours, and the ceiling has offered nothing of interest in return." It was in this atmosphere of cultivated restlessness that we received the morning's first visitor. Mrs. Hudson knocked, and entered, bearing her characteristic expression of well-contained disapproval, an expression reserved, I had observed, for those callers whose eminence obliged her to moderate what would otherwise have been a firm instruction to try again at a more civilized hour. "A Mr. Alistair Pembroke, Mr. Holmes," said she. "A barrister, he says. He seems most anxious to see you." Holmes stirred with the sudden alertness of a hound that has caught a scent. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson, by all means." The man who entered our sitting-room a moment later was of the type one associates instinctively with the law, not the theatrical law of the assize courts, but the quieter, more consequential law of chancery and conveyance. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with silver hair swept back from a broad forehead, and the carefully tended grey whiskers of a man who attends to appearances not from vanity but from professional duty. His coat was of excellent cloth, his bearing erect, and his hands, I noticed, were those of a man long accustomed to handling documents rather than physical labour. He carried a leather case of moderate size, and he held it, I thought, with rather more tension than its apparent weight warranted. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending his hand, "my name is Alistair Pembroke. I'm a barrister of Lincoln's Inn. I must apologise for the hour." "Sit down, Mr. Pembroke," said Holmes, waving him toward the basket chair. "This is my colleague Dr. Watson, in whom you may confide as freely as in myself. You need not apologise for the hour. I perceive that you have slept badly, and that the matter which brings you here has occupied your thoughts for several days at least. Pray proceed." Pembroke settled himself and placed the leather case upon his knees. He glanced at me once as though reassuring himself of my discretion, and then addressed Holmes with the measured precision of a man giving evidence. "I am engaged," said he, "in a matter of inheritance, a civil case. The estate of one Mr. Gerald Vane, deceased, a man of some property whose affairs fell into dispute upon his death some 4 months ago. The principal parties are his niece, Miss Eleanor Vane, who was named in the most recent version of the will, and a pair of cousins who contest the will's validity on grounds I need not detail here. The matter has been before a magistrate, and it was during the process of gathering witness evidence that this peculiarity arose. He opened the leather case and withdrew a folded document, which he held for a moment before placing it upon the table between them. "This," said he, "is a witness statement submitted on behalf of Miss Vane's position. It was provided by a gentleman named Elias Crowe, who presented himself as a former business associate of the late Mr. of Vane, a man who could speak to the testator's settled intention to leave the bulk of his estate to his niece. The statement is, from a legal standpoint, perfectly composed. It is coherent, internally consistent, and conforms to every formal requirement. It was accepted and entered into the proceedings." Holmes had taken up the document and was examining it with the focused attention he brought to a curious stain or an unfamiliar type of mud. He said nothing. "The difficulty," Pembroke continued, "is that Mr. Crowe has since vanished. He attended once, delivered the statement through proper channels, and was gone. Inquiries at the address he provided have yielded nothing. The landlady recalls a man of his description staying a single night, paying in advance, and departing before dawn." "And you suspect the statement to be fraudulent," said Holmes. "I suspect something," said Pembroke carefully. "What troubles me more particularly is that I cannot identify the lie. The statement contains no claim I can demonstrate to be false. Every assertion it makes regarding Mr. Vane's character and intentions is consistent with what others have said of him. It is, in a word, impeccable." "That," said Holmes quietly, "is precisely what troubles you, and precisely what troubles me." He set the document down and fixed Pembroke with a sharp look. "Tell me, who are the other principal figures in this matter? The solicitor managing the estate, the magistrate before whom the case is heard?" Pembroke provided the names methodically, as a man of his profession would. The family solicitor was one Mr. E. Hargreaves, of long-standing and excellent reputation. The magistrate, a Mr. Fortescue, had sat upon such civil matters for upward of 15 years without a blemish to his record. The clerk who had processed the statement was a young man named Rees, recently appointed and by all accounts diligent. Holmes listened without interruption, and when Pembroke had concluded he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingertips pressed together once more. Then he rose and took up the witness statement again, carrying it to the window where the thin autumn light fell upon it most fully. "The document itself," said he at last, "is interesting not for what it contains, but for what it does not. Tell me, Mr. Pembroke, in your experience of witness statements prepared by men of ordinary education and common professional life, do they habitually employ the subjunctive mood with such regularity? Do they structure their sentences with such scrupulous balance?" Pembroke blinked. "I confess I had not remarked upon it." "One seldom does remark upon what is absent," Holmes replied. "This statement reads as a document composed by a man thoroughly familiar with legal convention. Not merely a man repeating what he knows, but a man who understands precisely what form his words must take to be most useful. That is, in my experience, not the product of an ordinary witness. It is the product of someone who knew, before a single word was written, exactly what effect they wished to produce." He returned to his chair and looked at our visitor with an expression I knew well, the expression of a man who has observed something invisible to others and is deciding how much to reveal. "Leave the document with me, Mr. Pembroke," said he. "I shall want to visit the chambers where the statement was processed, and I shall want to speak with your clerk, Rees. Watson, are you at liberty this morning?" "I am entirely at your disposal," I said, with the honest pleasure of a man who had hoped for exactly such an invitation. "Excellent." Holmes turned back to Pembroke. "One final question. In the whole of the proceedings, has anyone offered a description of Mr. Crowe's physical appearance that struck you as particularly vivid or particularly consistent across multiple witnesses?" Pembroke considered. "Remarkably consistent now that you press me. Medium height, brown coat, quiet manner, Midlands accent." Several people remarked upon it in almost the same terms. Holmes said nothing, but the slight elevation of one eyebrow communicated to me who knew him, a satisfaction that he took some care to conceal. "Thank you, Mr. Pembroke," said he. "We shall be in touch before the day is out." When our visitor had gone, I looked at Holmes across the cluttered room. He had taken up the statement again, and was holding it to the light with the expression of a jeweller examining a stone of uncertain provenance. "You have already formed an opinion," said I. "I have formed an hypothesis," he corrected. "Which is a very different thing, Watson, and a great deal more useful. Come, let us go and look at the chambers of Lincoln's Inn. I find I'm suddenly very interested in the business of Mr. Elias Crowe." He set down the document, reached for his coat, and was at the door before I had risen from my chair. That familiar electric readiness which invariably signalled that the game, as he was fond of saying, was very much afoot. Chapter 2. The Circle of Reputable Men. Lincoln's Inn in the late morning possesses a quality of deliberate stillness that one encounters nowhere else in London. The great courts and gardens, enclosed by their ancient brick ranges, seem designed expressly to muffle the urgency of the city beyond their gates, to remind those who pass through them that the law moves at its own considered pace and will not be hurried by the noise of the world outside. The advocates and clerks one encounters there walk with the purposeful quiet of men who have learned that haste is, in most legal matters, merely an expensive form of error. Holmes strode through it all with his characteristic indifference to atmosphere, where I found myself slowing instinctively, conscious of the accumulated gravity of the place. He moved at a lean, rapid pace, his eyes in perpetual motion, his mind evidently engaged on some calculation he had not yet chosen to share with me. "You're quiet," I observed, as we crossed the broad flagstones toward the building Pembroke had indicated in his directions. "I am thinking," said Holmes, "which is, Watson, an activity that does not particularly benefit from narration." I accepted this with the equanimity of long practice, and followed him inside. The chambers in which the witness statement had been processed occupied the second floor of a building that smelled of old timber, sealing wax, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in rooms where paper has been stored for generations. A young man met us at the door of the outer office, slight, fair-haired, with the careful manner of someone who had been warned to expect us, and was not entirely certain how to comport himself under the circumstances. "Mr. Rees?" said Holmes. "Yes, sir. Mr. Pembroke sent word you were coming." He admitted us into a small, tidy room furnished with a writing table, 2 straight-back chairs, and an impressive quantity of bound ledgers. He hovered near his desk with the air of a man who would have preferred to remain behind it. Holmes settled into one of the chairs with easy authority, and regarded the young clerk with an attentiveness that I observed was causing the young man some discomfort, though Holmes gave no outward sign of concern about this effect. "Tell me about Mr. Crowe," said Holmes simply. Rees recounted his recollections with the conscientious thoroughness of a junior employee anxious to leave nothing out. Crowe had arrived on a Tuesday morning, had presented himself at the outer desk, and had deposited the statement in a sealed envelope addressed to the clerk of the proceedings. He had waited while Rees confirmed the documentation was in order, had signed a receipt, and had departed without incident. The entire visit had lasted, Rees estimated, no more than 20 minutes. His manner, Holmes prompted. "Very quiet, sir, polite. He asked for directions to the nearest omnibus stop on his way out. Said he was not familiar with that part of the city." "The precise words, if you can recall them?" Rees hesitated. "Something like, 'Would I be so kind as to point him toward the omnibus?' He was very correct about it. Very proper. A Midlands accent, I believe Mr. Pembroke mentioned." "Yes, sir. Birmingham, I should have said, or thereabouts." Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned his attention to the writing table. He studied the surface for a moment. I could see nothing of interest upon it, and then rose and moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused. "One more thing, Mr. Rees. When Crowe signed the receipt, did he sign without hesitation, or did he pause?" The young man's brow contracted. Yes, now you mention it, he paused. Quite briefly. I thought he was reading it over, which is perfectly normal. Quite so, said Holmes pleasantly. Thank you. You have been most helpful. Outside on the broad staircase I put the question that had been forming since we'd entered. What did you make of him? Of Rees? A careful young man, honest within his limits. What I make of the detail he provided is more interesting. Holmes descended the stairs at a pace that required me to keep up with some effort. A man who requests directions to the omnibus stop, yet pauses before signing his assumed name, the one act implying unfamiliarity with the district, the other betraying the fractional hesitation of a man who must remind himself who he is that morning. Small things, Watson, but small things are precisely what I came here to collect. Our next call was upon Miss Eleanor Vane, who received us in the drawing-room of a modest but well-kept house in Bloomsbury. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with a fine-boned face that would have been handsome in happier circumstances, but which was at present drawn with a fatigue that suggested weeks rather than days of accumulated strain. She wore half-mourning, which was appropriate to the season of her uncle's passing, and she received us with a composure that I thought, even at first meeting, had been achieved at some cost. She answered Holmes's questions directly and without apparent evasion. She had known of Elias Crowe by name. Her uncle had mentioned him once or twice as a former professional acquaintance, but she had never met the man herself, and had been gratified, if surprised, when he had come forward to offer a statement. She expressed no particular agitation at the news that Crowe had proved untraceable, though her hands, which rested in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly when Holmes observed that the matter might require further investigation. "I have nothing to conceal, Mr. Holmes," said she. "I am certain of it," Holmes replied, in a tone that was neither confirming nor dismissive. He asked a few further questions about her uncle's habits and associations, thanked her for her time, and departed with the unhurried courtesy of a man conducting a social call. On the pavement outside, I remarked that she had seemed genuinely distressed. "Genuinely, yes," Holmes agreed, "but not entirely on account of the matters she described. There is something she fears which she has not yet identified clearly enough to name. A woman of that composure does not tighten her hands without cause." The third interview of the morning proved the most instructive, though its instruction was of a type that only Holmes appeared to apprehend fully at the time. Mr. Hargreaves, the family solicitor, received us in his own offices, a more substantial establishment than Pembroke's, furnished with the deliberate solidity of a practice that wished to communicate permanence and reliability in every detail of its appointments. He was a broad, red-faced man of 50-something, ears with quick, pale eyes, and the expansive manner of a man accustomed to putting clients at their ease. He was, in a word, affable. He expressed appropriate concern at the irregularities surrounding Crowe. He confirmed the substance of the statement and vouched for its plausibility. He spoke of Miss Vane with warmth and of the legal process with judicious confidence. Every answer arrived promptly, each coloured by a reasonableness so perfectly calibrated that I found myself involuntarily inclined to trust him. It was only afterward, as we descended to the street, that I registered something I had noticed without consciously remarking upon it at the time. "He answered your questions," I said slowly, "before you had quite finished asking them." Holmes glanced at me with what I can only describe as approval. Precisely so. A man who is genuinely surprised by an inquiry must first absorb it. Hargreaves absorbed nothing. He had already prepared the ground. 3 times he preempted a question I had not yet completed, and in each instance his answer was— Holmes paused to find the word he wanted. Optimal, not merely truthful or merely plausible, but arranged to the best possible advantage. "You suspect him?" "I suspect," said Holmes carefully, "that all 3 of these individuals have told me the truth as they understand it to be safe to tell. That is not quite the same as the whole truth. And what strikes me most, Watson, setting the 3 accounts together, is a uniformity that goes beyond mere consistency." He flagged a passing cab with his cane and held the door for me before continuing. "Miss Vane, Rees, and Hargreaves have each described Crowe in terms so closely matched that one might almost believe they had consulted together upon the matter beforehand. He stepped in beside me and gave the driver the address of Baker Street. "Perhaps they simply remember the same man," I offered. "Perhaps," said Holmes. He settled back against the cushions and looked out at the passing rooftops, with the expression of a man turning a puzzle piece over and over in his mind. "Or perhaps they remember the same performance. There is a difference, Watson, between a man leaving an impression and a man arranging to leave a particular one. When men agree too well, they often agree upon a fiction, even if only one of them is aware of the original author." He said nothing further on the subject for the remainder of the journey, and I did not press him. I had learned, over the years, to trust the silences in which Holmes was most productively occupied. Chapter 3. The Sudden Death at Blackfriars. The telegram arrived at Baker Street the following morning while Holmes and I were at breakfast, or rather while I was at breakfast, and Holmes was conducting one of his periodic examinations of the commonplace book he kept for the indexing of criminal precedents, moving between its pages and his cold coffee with the abstracted energy of a man who eats only when the matter under investigation permits a pause. Mrs. Hudson brought the envelope on her salver with the particular expression she reserved for communications she suspected would disrupt the remainder of her day. She was, as usual, correct in her apprehension. Holmes read the telegram, set it down beside the toast rack, and read it a second time. Then he passed it across to me without comment. It was from Pembroke. The message was brief, and its contents were stark. Mr. Samuel Fortescue, the magistrate presiding over the Vane inheritance dispute, had been found dead that morning at his chambers in Blackfriars. The circumstances were, in Pembroke's careful legal phrasing, ambiguous. The case was suspended pending inquiry. He implored Holmes to come at once. I set the telegram down. Holmes had already risen from his chair. "Your coat, Watson," said he, "and perhaps your bag. One never knows what a magistrate's chambers may require of a medical man." The cab ride to Blackfriars was accomplished in a silence that I did not attempt to break. Holmes sat with his arms folded and his gaze fixed upon some middle distance invisible to me, and I occupied myself with watching the city shift around us, the broad commercial thoroughfares giving way to narrower lanes, and the particular congestion that attends the approaches to the river, where the smell of the Thames asserts itself over everything else regardless of the season. Pembroke met us at the entrance to the building. He looked, I thought, considerably older than he had the previous morning. The sleeplessness was evident in the set of his jaw and the careful manner in which he was holding himself together. He shook Holmes's hand with a grip that conveyed more than courtesy. "Inspector Lestrade is already inside," said he. "He has been tolerably civil about it, though I gather he has formed a view." "Lestrade generally forms a view with admirable swiftness," Holmes replied. "Whether the view survives contact with the facts is a separate question. Lead on." The magistrate's chambers were on the first floor, a well-appointed pair of rooms that spoke of a man who valued comfort without ostentation. The outer rooms served as a reception and waiting area. The inner was the working study where Fortescue had spent the greater part of his professional days. It was here that he had been found, slumped in his chair at the desk, by his clerk upon arrival at 8 o'clock that morning. The clerk, a thin, elderly man named Phelps, sat in the outer room in the custody of a uniformed constable and stared at his hands with the hollow expression of the recently bereaved. Inspector Lestrade stood in the centre of the inner room with the proprietary air of a man who considers himself in command of the situation. He was a lean, dark, ferret-faced fellow whose professional confidence I had observed, on more occasions than I could readily count, exceed the evidence available to support it. He greeted Holmes with the mixture of relief and defensiveness that had characterised their association for as long as I had known them both. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I won't say I'm surprised to see you, since Mr. Pembroke here has been on the telephone half the morning. We've a plain enough picture of it, I think." "Then you will have no objection to my looking about," said Holmes pleasantly, already moving. The room itself showed no sign of disturbance. Fortescue's papers were arranged upon the desk with the orderly precision of a methodical man. His pen rested in its stand. His books lined their shelves in good order. There was nothing overturned, nothing displaced, nothing suggestive of alarm or struggle. The body had already been removed, but the chalk outline and Lestrade's notes established that Fortescue had been found seated upright, apparently as though he had simply ceased. I made a circuit of the room from a medical perspective, noting the absence of any visible wound or injury as reported, and was about to remark as much to Holmes when I became aware that he had stopped at the magistrate's desk and was bending over the surface with his lens, his attention fixed upon something to the right of the central blotter. "The teacup," said he quietly. It sat in its saucer near the edge of the desk, still containing perhaps an inch of cold tea. To my eye it was entirely unremarkable. Holmes did not touch it, but bent lower still, bringing the lens within an inch of the interior surface, and I watched the slight alteration of his expression that I had come to recognise as the moment when observation becomes discovery. "Lestrade," said he, straightening, "I would strongly recommend that this cup be sent immediately to a laboratory. The interior surface bears a residue that I do not believe to be a natural consequence of strong tea left to cool." Lestrade crossed the room and peered at the cup with the expression of a man who cannot see what he is being shown. "It looks like tea to me, Mr. Holmes." "The tea is incidental. It is the film along the lower interior that interests me, faintly iridescent, adhering to the glaze in a pattern inconsistent with evaporation. I have seen its like once before, in a matter that need not detain us now, but the pattern is sufficiently distinct that I would not wish to leave it uninvestigated." He straightened fully and looked at Lestrade with the patient but purposeful air of a man who has made his recommendation and will now wait to observe whether it is acted upon. "Very well," said Lestrade, not without a degree of reluctance that suggested he was conceding a point he did not yet understand. "I'll have it sent to the laboratory." He paused. "You think he was poisoned, then?" "I think the cup warrants examination," Holmes replied, which was not quite the same thing, and which Lestrade appeared to accept as sufficient. It was as we were preparing to leave that the inspector delivered the intelligence that altered the character of the whole affair. "There is one further thing," said Lestrade, consulting his notebook. "The deceased clerk, Phelps, in the outer room, informs us that the magistrate had been expressing reservations about the Vane case for the better part of a week, specifically about the Crow statement. Phelps says Fortescue told him, in those words, that something about it did not sit right with him, and that he intended to raise the matter formally at the next sitting. The silence that followed this intelligence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Did Phelps indicate whether Fortescue had shared these reservations with anyone beyond himself? Holmes asked. "He says the magistrate wrote 2 letters on the subject, one to Pembroke, which Pembroke confirms receiving, one to the solicitor of record, Hargreaves." Holmes made no visible response to this. He thanked Lestrade, shook Pembroke's hand, and guided me gently but firmly toward the door. It was only when we had descended to the street and were standing in the grey Blackfriars air, the river dark and sluggish beyond the embankment wall, that he spoke. "Well, Watson," said he. "Hargreaves knew the magistrate suspected the statement," I said. "Hargreaves knew the magistrate intended to act upon his suspicions," Holmes corrected, "which is considerably more urgent a circumstance for a man with something to protect." He looked up and down the street with the abstracted gaze of a man conducting an internal computation. What was a peculiarity has become a matter of some gravity. A false witness identity is one order of problem. A dead magistrate is quite another. "Do you believe it was murder?" He was quiet for a moment. A barge passed on the river below us, its low horn carrying up through the mist with a sound like a distant question. "I believe," said he at last, "that the teacup will tell us what it knows, and that we must be ready to hear it. In the meantime, I want very much to look again at the Crow statement, and I want to know a good deal more about the professional history of Mr. Hargreaves." He turned from the river and set his face toward the street. "Come, there is work to be done, and Lestrade will undoubtedly be of no further assistance until the laboratory has told him what to think." I fell into step beside him, and we walked north, away from the water, into the city's close and purposeful noise. Chapter 4. Of Ink and Accent. We returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon to find that Mrs. Hudson had, in our absence, restored some semblance of order to the sitting room. The newspapers had been gathered into a stack, the breakfast things removed, and a fresh fire laid against the deepening chill of the October day. Holmes acknowledged none of these improvements. He went directly to the desk, retrieved the Crow statement from the drawer in which he had placed it the previous evening, and carried it to the window table, where he spread it flat and drew up his chair with the focused deliberation of a man settling in for a sustained engagement. I poured myself a cup of tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided, took my customary chair, and waited. For perhaps 20 minutes there was no sound in the room beyond the quiet work of the fire and the occasional distant passage of traffic below. Holmes sat with his lens moving across the document in a slow, methodical progression. Not the hurried scan of a man looking for something specific, but the patient traversal of a man prepared to be surprised by whatever presented itself. Once he paused, bent very close, and remained still for nearly a minute. Once he turned the document over and examined the reverse with equal care before returning to the front. At length, he set the lens down and leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together in the familiar arch. "Come and look at this," said he. I crossed to the window table and looked where he indicated, the third paragraph of the statement, midway down the page. Holmes placed his finger beneath a sequence of letters without touching the surface. The capital letters first. Observe the H in Hargreaves, there in the second line, and compare it with the H in he at the opening of the paragraph below. I looked. The two letters were, to my initial inspection, identical. Elegant, slightly forward-leaning, formed with a confident single stroke. "They appear the same to me," I said. "The general form is the same," Holmes agreed. "Now look at the exit stroke, the small horizontal flourish at the base of the right vertical. In the first instance it curves inward, toward the body of the word. In the second it turns outward, away from it. A trivial variation, one might say. Habitual inconsistency in a natural hand, but follow it through the document." I followed it, with Holmes directing my attention from instance to instance, and within a few minutes I had seen enough to understand what he was demonstrating. The inconsistency was not random. It recurred in a pattern, appearing most frequently in the longer, more complex sentences, as though the writer's concentration upon the construction of the phrase had allowed some other, more deeply habitual formation to assert itself momentarily before being suppressed. "Two hands," I said. "One hand," Holmes corrected, "operating under two influences. The dominant style is cultivated. Practiced, I should say, over a period of weeks or months to produce a consistent, educated English character. But beneath it, emerging under the particular cognitive demand of a complex sentence, is a second formation. Those outward exit strokes are characteristic of a continental cursive tradition. Specifically, I believe, the style taught in Belgian and northern French commercial academies in the latter decades of the previous century." He tapped the document lightly. Our Mr. Crow composed this statement in a hand he had learned to imitate. He had learned it very well, but not quite well enough. I returned to my chair and turned this over in my mind. "You said yesterday that the statement read as the work of someone trained in legal language. Now you are saying the writer was educated on the continent." "Both things may be true simultaneously," said Holmes. "A man may receive a continental education, and subsequently acquire a thorough familiarity with English legal forms. What is interesting is that he took pains to disguise the continental character of his hand, which suggests he was aware it might be identified and wished to prevent it." He rose from the table and moved to the mantelpiece, taking up his pipe and filling it in the absent, automatic manner that indicated his mind was engaged elsewhere. "There is the question of the accent," I said, recalling what Rees had told us the previous morning. "Birmingham," the clerk thought. "Midlands, at any rate." Yes, and Miss Vane's uncle, who supposedly employed this man in a professional capacity, was himself a Londoner of 30 years' standing, whose business interests, according to Pembroke, were entirely metropolitan. What professional association brings a Birmingham man into the orbit of a London merchant sufficiently intimate for the merchant to confide his testamentary intentions? Holmes applied a match to his pipe. Add to that the clothing. I had not yet heard about the clothing. I said as much. Holmes produced his notebook from his coat pocket and consulted it briefly. He had, I realised, been gathering details throughout our interviews of the previous day that he had not yet shared with me. Pembroke described Crow, when I pressed him this morning before we left, as wearing a brown coat of good quality, well maintained. Rees described a brown coat that was clean but showed wear at the cuffs. The landlady at the lodging house where Crow spent his single night. I sent a telegram to her yesterday evening and received her reply this morning. Described a man in a grey coat with a brown muffler. He closed the notebook. Now, these discrepancies may be explained by imperfect observation, which is the condition of most human witness, but they accumulate in a suggestive direction. Each witness has noticed something real and described it accurately, yet the descriptions do not cohere into a single man. They cohere into the memory of an impression, a general sense of quiet, respectable ordinariness, without the specific consistency that an actual individual would leave behind. As though each person saw what they expected to see, I said slowly. As though each person was shown what they were intended to see, Holmes replied. Which is a subtly different proposition. Crow's appearance was designed to be forgettable in its particulars, and memorable only in its overall register. Quiet, respectable, unremarkable. A man assembled from the components of plausibility rather than grown from the substance of a life. He stood for a moment in silence, smoking, and then crossed to his index volumes on the shelf beside the desk. Those remarkable indexed commonplace books in which he had catalogued, over years of patient labour, a vast accumulation of criminal knowledge and professional cross-reference. He ran his finger along the spines, selected a volume, and opened it at a page I could not read from where I sat. He studied it for some moments and then closed it again without comment. "There is a man," said he carefully, known in certain continental legal circles as a practitioner of what one might call documentary fraud, the construction of false but plausible legal instruments for use in inheritance and probate disputes. He operated principally in Belgium and northern France during the 90s, with at least 2 known excursions into Swiss jurisdictions. He has never, to my knowledge, been active in England. His name, or one of his names, is of no consequence for the present. What is of consequence is his method. He returned the volume to its place and turned to face me. He does not forge documents in the crude sense. He does not replicate signatures or alter existing instruments. Instead, he constructs identities for the purpose of submitting testimony that is technically truthful in every verifiable particular, yet misleading in its essential effect. His witnesses exist long enough to testify and no longer. They have addresses for a night, names for a week, histories for a month, sufficient to pass scrutiny at the moment required, insufficient to survive sustained investigation. Holmes looked at me steadily. The Crow statement bears the hallmarks of his workmanship, the legal precision, the cultivated hand, the identity engineered to leave a general impression without specific substance. Then Crow was this man's creation, I said. Or this man's performance, said Holmes. We must return to speak with Rees. I have one further question for him. A small thing, but I have found that small things in cases of this kind are precisely where the truth conceals itself. He knocked his pipe out against the grate and reached for his coat. The question of who commissioned the performance is the one that matters most. A forger of this sophistication does not volunteer his services. He is engaged, and the person who engaged him is someone who already knew what evidence the case required and had the access and standing to arrange its delivery. He paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression in which I thought I detected the particular quality of a man who has caught the distant outline of his quarry and is being careful not to move too quickly. Someone, said he quietly, who knew the legal process from the inside. Chapter 5. The Performance of Grief. The following morning brought with it a change in the weather. The pale, composed skies of the preceding days gave way to a low, pressing overcast that sat upon the rooftops like a judgment, sir, and by the time Holmes and I had breakfasted and set out for Bloomsbury, a fine, persistent rain had begun, the kind that does not commit to being a downpour but declines, hour after hour, to relent. Holmes had been in an unusual humour since rising. He had eaten with something approaching appetite, had played 4 bars of Mendelssohn on his violin before abandoning it in favour of his notebook, and had made several entries in the latter with the air of a man consolidating a position before advancing. I had long since learned not to interpret his moods as indices of confidence or doubt. He was capable of profound stillness when most certain and of restless agitation when a problem had yet to offer him any purchase at all. What the Mendelssohn signified I could not have said, but the notebook entries I suspected. Yet meant that several threads had been drawn sufficiently taut that their connecting points were now becoming visible. He said as we turned out of Baker Street into the rain, "I want you to watch her hands today." Miss Vane's? Her hands, and the quality of her silences. Grief, genuine grief, has a particular texture. It does not fill every available space, but it does not entirely vacate the room either. It sits between things. What I wish to determine this morning is whether what Miss Vane carries is grief for her uncle, or fear of something she has not yet been able to articulate, or, and this is the possibility that interests me most, a compound of both, each one genuine in itself, but arising from different sources. I considered this as we walked. You think she knows more than she told us? I think she knows something whose significance she has not recognised. Those are quite different conditions, and they produce quite different observable symptoms. He turned up his collar against the rain. A woman who is concealing information presents one face. A woman who possesses information she does not know to be relevant presents another. The first is guarded, the second is merely incomplete. Miss Vane received us in the same drawing-room as before, but the room itself felt altered. The light was different, reduced by the heavy sky outside, and several objects had been rearranged since our previous visit, in a manner suggesting not deliberate redecoration, but the restless movement of a person who had been unable to remain still. A book lay open and face down upon the arm of a chair in the attitude of something abandoned mid-reading rather than set aside with intention. The fire was built rather higher than the temperature of the room strictly required. She greeted us with the same composure as before, but I thought, watching carefully as Holmes had instructed, that the composure was more effortful this morning. The previous visit had caught her in a state of managed equilibrium. 2 additional days of uncertainty had worn at the management. Holmes took the chair nearest hers and leaned forward slightly, not in the manner of a man pressing an advantage, but with the quality of attentiveness that I had seen him employ to great effect over the years. The manner of a person who is genuinely interested in what you are about to say, and wishes you to feel that interest before you say it. "Miss Vane," said he, "I shall not take a great deal of your time this morning, and I shall not ask you to revisit what we have already covered. I have only a few questions of a rather different character. I hope you will bear with me." She inclined her head. "Your uncle, in the final months before his death, did you observe any change in his ordinary habits? Any new correspondence, perhaps, or visitors of a kind that struck you as unusual?" She was quiet for a moment, the genuine, reflective silence of a person searching memory, rather than composing an answer. "He received a letter in August," she said at last. "He did not show it to me, but I was with him when it arrived, and I saw that it altered his manner for the rest of that day. He was distracted at dinner and retired early. He said nothing about it. Did you see the envelope?" "Briefly. The hand was very neat. I noticed it because my uncle's own correspondence tended toward the illegible." A faint trace of something almost like affection crossed her face at this, and as quickly withdrew. "I did not see the sender's name." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something already suspected rather than offering new intelligence. "One further question. Mr. Hargreaves, your uncle's solicitor, and your own in these proceedings. How long had your uncle employed him?" 7 years, I believe. Perhaps 8. He came very highly recommended when my uncle's previous solicitor retired. And you yourself? You're comfortable with his management of the estate? The question was delivered with perfect neutrality, as a matter of professional inquiry, and Miss Vane answered it in kind. He has been very thorough, very attentive. I have had no cause for complaint. She paused, and in the pause I watched, as Holmes had directed me, her hands. They rested in her lap upon the dark fabric of her skirt, and as she spoke of Hargreaves they tightened, not dramatically, not in any way she appeared to register consciously, but with the involuntary tension of a person responding to a stimulus before the conscious mind has formed an opinion about it. He has called twice this week to offer reassurance about the suspension of proceedings. Twice, Holmes repeated pleasantly. That is attentive indeed. When we left, the rain had not abated. We stood for a moment beneath the narrow shelter of the doorway while Holmes turned up his collar again and I relayed what I had observed. Her hands tightened when she spoke of Hargreaves. They did, said Holmes. And did you note the precise moment, I thought back, when she said he had been thorough, attentive? When she offered words of professional approbation that her body declined to ratify, Holmes said. She is not suspicious of him in any articulate sense. She has no reason to be, and she is not a woman given to vague discomforts without foundation. But something in her experience of his attentiveness this week has registered as discordant without her yet knowing why. He stepped out into the rain and I followed. Twice in a week, Watson. A solicitor who visits twice in a week to offer reassurance to a client whose case has been suspended is either exceptionally conscientious or exceptionally anxious that the client's narrative remains stable. We walked for a time in silence. Then I said, there was the letter her uncle received in August. Yes, August, which would place it approximately 6 weeks before the statement was submitted, and perhaps 8 weeks before Fortescue began expressing reservations about the case. Holmes's pace quickened slightly, which I had come to read as the physical expression of an accelerating mental process. Her uncle was disturbed by a letter in a very neat hand. The Crow statement was composed in a very neat hand. I do not draw a conclusion from that alone. Neat handwriting is not singular, but I note the proximity. You think the letter was a warning of some kind? That Vane himself suspected something was wrong? I think it is possible that Gerald Vane received intelligence that unsettled him profoundly, and that he confided it to no one, not even his niece. Men of his generation, Watson, frequently elected to carry private burdens without distribution. Whether from pride or from protection of those they cared for, the effect is the same. The knowledge dies with them, and the people who might have acted upon it are left with nothing but the observable alteration in a man's manner at dinner. He stopped at the corner and looked back at the house, its windows grey against the grey sky. Her grief is genuine, said he. I am satisfied of that. She mourns her uncle sincerely. But she is also afraid, and the fear is not of the legal proceedings or of the possibility of losing the estate. It is something closer, something in the immediate environment of the case, that her instincts have identified and her reason has not yet caught up with. He turned from the house. We must ensure that her reason is given the opportunity to do so before whoever has arranged all of this decides that her instincts represent an inconvenience requiring management. The flatness with which he delivered this last remark, the same tone one might employ in observing that the weather showed no sign of improvement, impressed upon me, more forcefully than any dramatic declaration could have done, the seriousness of what he suspected. I said nothing. There was, I felt, nothing adequate to say. We walked on into the rain, and the city closed around us in its ordinary indifferent way. Chapter 6. The Man Who Was Not There. There are investigations in which the evidence accumulates with a kind of inevitability, each new fact falling into its appointed place with the satisfying weight of confirmation. And then there are investigations of the type Holmes most relished, the kind in which the evidence properly examined reveals not what is present but what is absent, and where the absence, once perceived, proves more eloquent than any positive fact could have been. The 2 days following our second visit to Miss Vane were among the most industrious I had witnessed Holmes undertake without leaving Baker Street. He sent telegrams in considerable numbers to Somerset House, to the General Register Office, to the Birmingham City Directories, to 3 separate inquiry agents whose professional reliability he had tested on previous occasions, and to one correspondent in Brussels whose identity he declined to share with me beyond the observation that the man had, in Holmes's phrase, an encyclopedic memory for the criminal applications of the notarial arts. He received replies with the methodical patience of a spider at the centre of a web, reading each one at the desk, making a note, and setting it in a growing pile to his right. I spent much of this period at my own affairs. A medical acquaintance had requested my opinion on a paper he was preparing for the Lancet, and I gave the matter what attention I could spare from the rather more compelling drama unfolding across Baker Street. In truth, I was not unwelcome at the desk, but I had learned that there are phases of Holmes's work during which company, however congenial, constitutes a form of friction. I was present enough to observe and absent enough not to impede. Yet on the morning of the 3rd day he greeted me at breakfast with the focused brightness of a man who has completed a disagreeable but necessary calculation, and found the answer to be exactly as unpleasant as he had anticipated. "Elias Crow does not exist," said he, without preliminary. He spread across the breakfast table, with no apparent concern for the toast and the marmalade, a collection of documents and handwritten notes that formed, I saw, the compiled responses to his telegraphic inquiries. No birth registration under that name in Birmingham, Manchester, or any of the other Midland registration districts within a reasonable range of the stated age. No electoral record, no trade or professional directory entry, no record of lodgings beyond the single night in Clerkenwell, no death registry entry, no parish record, no match in any of the London professional registers, legal, commercial or otherwise. He placed his finger on a sheet from his Brussels correspondent. And this, which is perhaps the most instructive of all. I leaned across and read the relevant passage. The correspondent, whose English was precise and whose knowledge of the subject was evidently considerable, confirmed that a practitioner of documentary fraud known under various names and most recently operating from Antwerp had been identified some years previously as the author of at least 4 false witness identities used in continental probate and inheritance proceedings. In 2 of those cases, the false identity had been accompanied by a witness statement of exceptional legal precision. In one, the constructed witness had presented with a convincing regional accent markedly at odds with his educated vocabulary. The correspondent noted that the practitioner was known to conduct his English operations when he undertook them through an intermediary, a London contact who handled the placement of documents and the arrangement of the constructed identity's brief physical appearances. "He has a London agent," I said. "He has had a London agent since at least the mid-90s, if my correspondent's information is reliable, and I have no reason to doubt it. An intermediary who possesses sufficient knowledge of English legal procedure to know precisely what form a statement must take, sufficient access to the relevant proceedings to ensure its acceptance, and sufficient standing to arrange the practical details, the lodging-house, the clerk at Lincoln's Inn, the signed receipt, without attracting suspicion." I set the letter down. Outside, the morning was brightening marginally, a pale sun making its tentative case against the clouds. An intermediary with legal standing, or the appearance of it. Holmes gathered the documents together with quick, careful hands and squared them into a neat pile. "There is something further. I asked one of my inquiry agents to look into the professional history of Mr. Hargreaves rather more thoroughly than a surface inspection would permit." He extracted a single sheet from the pile. Hargreaves qualified as a solicitor in 1881. He practised first in Portsmouth, then in Bristol, then in London from 1891 onward. His London practice was established with what my agent characterises as unusual rapidity. A substantial client list acquired within 18 months of opening. Referrals that cannot be fully traced to any obvious source. Among his Bristol period clients, 3 were parties to inheritance disputes in which documentation was subsequently questioned, though in no case was any formal charge brought. In each instance, the questioning arose too late to affect the outcome. He let this settle for a moment. 3 cases, I said, all inheritance disputes, and in each of them, the questioning arose too late, not because the evidence was unavailable, but because the proceedings had concluded by the time any inconsistency was formally raised. The pattern is consistent with a system in which documentation is constructed to survive scrutiny for precisely as long as required and no longer. The inquirer arrives after the verdict, examines the rubble, and finds nothing actionable. He stood and moved to the window, looking down at Baker Street with his hands clasped behind his back. Fortescue was different. Fortescue grew suspicious before the proceedings concluded. He wrote to Hargreaves to say so. Which made him a problem that required solving, I said. Before he could act upon his suspicions formally, yes, Holmes turned from the window. And now Lestrade, who has the constabulary's dependable talent for approaching the most direct route to a conclusion by the longest available detour, has the laboratory report on the teacup. He produced one further document, this one delivered by messenger that morning, a brief official communication from the Metropolitan Police Laboratory, and handed it to me. The report was written in the economical language of scientific analysis. The residue on the interior of the teacup had been identified as containing traces of a compound derived from the processing of a specific plant alkaloid. The compound was described as rare in ordinary commerce, but findable in certain preserved legal and medical specimens held in evidence storage. It was not a substance available across any counter or through any ordinary commercial channel. Ingestion in sufficient quantity would produce cardiac arrest with no immediately visible cause. Good God, I said. A precise and effective poison, administered in tea, producing a death that any but the most attentive examining physician would record as natural. The magistrate was 63, Watson, and not, by Phelps's account, in robust health. The death would have passed without scrutiny had Pembroke not had the instinct to call upon me, and had I not had the instinct to look at the teacup. Holmes returned to his chair, and sat with the stillness of a man who is about to move decisively. The compound source is the detail that interests me most. Legal evidence storage, not a pharmacist, not a private collection, not an illicit supply chain. A repository to which a solicitor of sufficient standing and tenure would have entirely legitimate and unquestioned access. I set the laboratory report down on top of the pile of telegrams and looked at Holmes across the table. "You have enough to go to Lestrade," I said. "I have a pattern," Holmes replied, "which is not quite the same as evidence. What I have demonstrated is that Elias Crow is a fabrication consistent with the method of a known continental forger, that Hargreaves has a professional history consistent with having employed that forger before, and that the poison used was accessible to someone in Hargreaves's professional position. Each element is suggestive. Together they are compelling. But Lestrade requires a mechanism, not a pattern, and the mechanism I do not yet entirely possess." He drummed his fingers once upon the arm of his chair. "I need to know how the statement was delivered to the proceedings in a manner that bypassed any scrutiny Hargreaves could not control. And I need to know, I strongly suspect, but I do not yet know, who was positioned physically to administer the compound to Fortescue's tea." He reached for his pipe, changed his mind, and stood again. "We shall return to Lincoln's Inn," said he. "There is one question I did not ask Mr. Rees on our first visit, and I find that its absence has been troubling me with increasing insistence since yesterday evening." "What question?" I asked, reaching for my coat. Holmes paused at the door with the slight composed smile of a man who has earned the right to a small theatrical moment. "I wish to know," said he, who recommended him for his position. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. We did not, as it transpired, reach Lincoln's Inn that morning. We had descended to the street, and Holmes had raised his hand for a cab when a constable arrived at something approaching a run from the direction of Marylebone Road. Spotted Holmes with the practised eye of a man who has been given a description, and told to find its subject promptly, and presented himself with a breathlessness that suggested both urgency and recent vigorous exercise. "Mr. Holmes, sir. Inspector Lestrade's compliments, and would you come to Scotland Yard at once? There has been a development in the Vane matter." Holmes lowered his hand. The cab he had flagged passed on without stopping. "What manner of development?" "A confession, sir. Lestrade says it arrived this morning." Holmes said nothing for a moment. I watched his face, which was entirely still in the way that a surface of water is still before something moves beneath it. "Very well," said he. "We shall come." We rode to Scotland Yard in a silence more complete than our earlier cab journeys, and I did not attempt to penetrate it. Holmes sat with his arms folded and his gaze directed inward, and once, toward the end of the journey, he made a small sound. Not quite a word, not quite dismissive. That might have been the compressed expression of a thought he had decided not to voice. Lestrade received us in his office with the manner of a man who has unexpectedly found the solution to a difficult problem on his desk, and is permitting himself a modest degree of satisfaction about it. And he was not quite triumphant. Lestrade knew Holmes too well for uncomplicated triumph, but he was composed in the particular way of a professional who believes the principal difficulty of a case has resolved itself. "Sit down, gentlemen," said he, and spread before us on the desk a handwritten document of 3 pages. This came in by the early post. The man presented himself at the front desk at 7:30, asked to speak to the officer responsible for the Vane inquiry, and gave this statement freely and without prompting. His name is Thomas Geddes. He was, until 3 weeks ago, a clerk in the chambers of Mr. Hargreaves. I read the statement while Holmes sat with his hands in his lap, making no move to examine it himself. Geddes' account was detailed, circumstantially rich, and damning. He stated that Miss Eleanor Vane had approached him some 6 months previously through an intermediary, that she had offered him a substantial sum, £200, he specified, with a further 100 upon completion, to arrange for a false witness statement to be prepared and submitted in support of her inheritance claim. He had engaged an acquaintance with the necessary skills. He had managed the practical arrangements, the lodging house, the appointment at Lincoln's Inn, the constructed identity. He had, he wrote, been overwhelmed by guilt since the magistrate's death, and could no longer in conscience remain silent. The statement was signed in a firm hand. It was, from a formal standpoint, a complete and apparently voluntary confession to the subordinate elements of the fraud, presented in such a way as to place the authorship of the scheme squarely upon Miss Vane. Lestrade was watching Holmes throughout. When I set the document down, he looked across at my companion with an air of inquiry that contained beneath its surface a degree of apprehension. Holmes had not moved. "Well?" said Lestrade. "Who brought this man in?" Holmes asked. "He came of his own accord. I told you." At 7:30 in the morning, before the post offices are open for general business, before most professional men have reached their desks, at an hour when Scotland Yard's front desk is managed by the overnight duty sergeant who would have had no particular briefing on this case, Holmes looked up for the first time. A man consumed by guilt generally does not select the most efficient possible hour for its expression. Guilt is nocturnal, Lestrade. It keeps a man awake and drives him to his desk at 2 a.m. to compose a letter which he then delays posting for 3 days. It does not prompt him to arrive at a police station at 7:30 with a completed signed 3-page statement. Lestrade shifted in his chair. Men respond to these things differently. They do. But I note several additional curiosities. Holmes leaned forward and for the first time took up the statement. He did not read it again. He turned it over, examined the paper, and held it briefly to the light from the window. This paper is of the quality used in professional legal correspondence, not the paper a dismissed clerk would have to hand in his lodgings. The handwriting is consistent throughout, without the alterations in pressure and angle that attend genuinely emotional composition. The paragraphing is logical and sequential, and the sum specified, £200 with a further 100 on completion, is oddly precise for a recollection presented as the product of a guilty conscience rather than a business record. He set it down again. "Where is Geddes now?" he asked. "We have him in a room downstairs. We were about to—" "I should like to speak with him before you proceed further." Lestrade hesitated, and I could see the competing impulses cross his face. Professional courtesy toward Holmes, institutional reluctance to surrender control of what appeared to be a neat conclusion, and the residual caution of a man who had been surprised by Holmes's reasoning on enough previous occasions to know that resistance carried risk. Caution prevailed, as it generally did. 5 minutes, said Lestrade. Thomas Geddes was a man of about 40, with the pallor of someone who had either slept badly or not at all, and the careful blankness of expression of a man who has rehearsed a position and is holding to it by effort of will. He sat at the plain table in the interview room with his hands flat before him, and met Holmes's gaze with the determined steadiness of someone instructed to appear cooperative. Holmes sat down across from him, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his legs with the ease of a man settling in for a conversation of no particular urgency. "You were dismissed from Hargreaves's chambers 3 weeks ago," said Holmes pleasantly. "I resigned," Geddes said, with a precision that was itself informative. "On what grounds?" A pause of perhaps 2 seconds, brief enough to seem natural, long enough for Holmes, I knew, to register. "Differences of professional opinion?" "And in the 3 weeks since your resignation, you've been engaged in composing this statement." Holmes indicated the document, which Lestrade had brought with him. "A document in which you accept considerable personal liability for a fraud in order to implicate Miss Vane. That is, on any account, a remarkable degree of conscientiousness toward a woman who, on your own testimony, paid you £300. Geddes said nothing. "Who suggested that you come forward?" Holmes asked in the same pleasant and conversational tone. "No one suggested it. I told the inspector. I came of my own accord." "Of course." Holmes stood without haste. "One final question, Mr. Geddes. When Miss Vane's intermediary first approached you, how did this person know that you were the appropriate person to approach? That is, how did they know you had both the relevant access and the relevant acquaintance with the necessary skills?" The silence that followed was of a different quality from the preceding ones. Geddes had prepared for many questions, but not evidently for this one. The blankness of his expression developed, over the course of 3 or 4 seconds, a faint crack, like ice registering a change in temperature. It was known in certain circles," he said at last. "Certain circles," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Geddes." In the corridor outside, Lestrade pulled the door to and turned to Holmes with the expression of a man who senses the approaching dissolution of his tidy conclusion, but has not yet accepted it. "You think he's lying," said Lestrade. "I think he's performing," Holmes replied, "which is not the same as lying, or not entirely. He believes or has been persuaded that what he's doing serves his interests. The question is who persuaded him, and what was offered in exchange." He looked at Lestrade with the directness he reserved for moments when he wished to be absolutely clear. "Do not release him, and do not act upon this statement. Miss Vane should not be arrested." Lestrade stiffened. "Mr. Holmes, I have a signed confession." "You have," said Holmes, "the most convenient form of evidence." "A confession, Lestrade? It is the most convenient form of evidence, particularly when it arrives too soon, too early in the morning, on professional paper, from a man who cannot explain how he was found." He took up his hat and gloves. "Give me 48 hours. If I am wrong, the confession will still be here, and you may act upon it with my blessing." He walked out into the corridor and I followed, and I noted, as I often did at such moments, how completely he appeared to have already left the room before he had physically departed it, his mind already elsewhere, already working, already several steps down a road the rest of us had not yet located. "Watson," said he as we reached the stair, "we must now go to Lincoln's Inn. There is no longer any time to lose." Chapter 8. The Quiet Verification. Lincoln's Inn received us for the 3rd time in as many days with its customary indifference. The rain had finally relented, leaving the flagstones dark and the air carrying that particular sharpened quality that follows prolonged dampness, clean, cold, faintly mineral. The late afternoon light lay at a low angle across the courts, throwing the brick ranges into a relief that made them seem, momentarily more ancient and more solid than any individual building had a right to appear. Holmes moved through it all with a purposefulness that discouraged conversation. I had learned to read the gradations of his silence. These, and what I observed now was not the inward abstraction of a man assembling a hypothesis, but the concentrated forward movement of a man who knows precisely what he is looking for and intends to find it before the available light fails. Young Rees was still at his desk in the outer office, apparently engaged in copying entries into one of the larger ledgers. He looked up at our arrival with an expression in which I thought I detected, beneath the surface courtesy, a faint unease, the particular discomfort of a person who has been waiting for something to happen, without being entirely certain what that something will be. "Mr. Holmes," said he, rising, "I did not know you were coming." "I have one question for you," Holmes said, settling into the chair across from the writing desk with the air of a man who does not intend the visit to be a long one. "When you were appointed to this position, who recommended you for it?" Rees was still for a moment. Then he sat down again, slowly, with the deliberateness of a person who is deciding something. "Mr. Hargreaves," said he. He was a friend of my father's. He mentioned the position to my father, and my father mentioned it to me." Holmes nodded, without any alteration of expression that I could detect. "How long have you held the post?" 8 months, sir." "And the Vane matter? When did the statement arrive in your hands relative to your appointment?" "About 5 months in." Rees hesitated, and then, with the air of a man who has been carrying something and has decided to set it down, said, "Mr. Holmes, is something wrong? I mean, beyond what is apparent. I have been thinking since your first visit that you were asking questions whose purpose I did not entirely understand, and I have found that I cannot stop thinking about it." Holmes looked at him for a moment with an attention I recognised as genuine, not the analytical scrutiny he applied to suspects, but the considered regard he extended to persons whose honesty he was in the process of confirming. "You processed the statement in good faith," said Holmes. "Whatever has been arranged here, you are not part of it. But I want you to think carefully before answering this next question. When the statement arrived, did it arrive before or after the date stamped upon the submission receipt?" The question visibly surprised him. He turned to his ledgers without being asked, and ran his finger down the entries with the focused attention of a man to whom the precision of records is a matter of professional integrity. It was. He stopped. He looked at the entry again. Then he looked up at Holmes with an expression from which all careful composure had departed. "It was entered here on the 14th, but the receipt is dated the 16th. 2 days, Holmes said quietly. "I do not. How is that possible? I date the entry on the day of receipt. I am very particular about it." "You are," Holmes agreed, "which is why the discrepancy is so interesting. The document was in this office before the man who supposedly delivered it had arrived to deliver it." He stood. "I'm going to ask you to do something that may seem unusual. I want you to make a precise copy of that entry and the corresponding receipt date, witnessed by a colleague if possible, and to send it by messenger to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard this evening. This is important. It should go to Lestrade directly, not through any other channel." Rees stared at him. Yes, of course." In the street outside, I put the question that had been forming since the interview began. "Hargreaves placed Rees in that position," I said, 8 months ago, which is before the Vane case reached the critical stage." 6 months before the statement was submitted," Holmes confirmed, walking at a pace I found necessary to match with some effort. "Rees is not a party to the fraud. He is genuinely conscientious, which is precisely why he was useful. A careless clerk would have introduced unpredictable errors. A careful clerk, placed in position in advance, could be relied upon to process the document correctly, date it accurately, and handle it in exactly the manner the proceedings required, all in perfect good faith, without the smallest suspicion that anything was amiss." He turned his collar up against the cold. But Hargreaves did not anticipate that Rees's very conscientiousness with his records would produce a discrepancy. The statement was delivered to the office 2 days before Crowe appeared in person to execute the submission receipt. Someone placed the document in advance, possibly during an authorised visit by Hargreaves himself, possibly through another agent. The receipt was post-dated to create the appearance of simultaneous delivery, and Rees's entry, made on the actual date of receipt, preserved the discrepancy without his knowing it. The honest record-keeper is an inadvertent witness, Holmes said. It is rather satisfying in its way. We took a cab to Bartholomew's Hospital, where Holmes had, it emerged, made an arrangement earlier in the day with a colleague in the chemistry department, a Dr. Forsyth whom I knew slightly by reputation as a man of considerable expertise in alkaloid toxicology. Forsyth received us in his laboratory, a room of organised complexity that reminded me agreeably of Holmes's own working arrangements when a chemical investigation was in progress. He confirmed what the Scotland Yard report had already established, but with a specificity that the official document had lacked. The compound in question was extracted from a plant source and subjected to a particular preservation process that maintained its potency over extended storage. In its preserved form, it was found most commonly in a small number of medical and legal specimen collections, legal evidence storage being among the most probable sources, given the compound's historical appearance in a poisoning case some years previously, the physical evidence from which had been retained per standard procedure. Could a layman obtain it from such storage? Holmes asked. Forsyth considered. A layman, no. The storage facilities require authorised access, the sort extended to legal professionals directly engaged with relevant proceedings, not a clerk, not a constable. Someone of sufficient standing to be given unaccompanied access. A solicitor of 15 years' standing managing an active estate case. That would qualify, yes. Holmes thanked him with genuine warmth, and we departed into an evening that had turned properly cold, the gas lamps beginning to assert themselves against the darkening sky. On the pavement outside the hospital, I worked through the completed picture as I understood it. You now have the mechanism, I said. The statement was placed in the office in advance, giving it 2 days of existence before Crowe appeared to perform the delivery. The poison was taken from legal evidence storage by someone with Hargreaves's access. Rees's ledger entry preserves the discrepancy. 3 independent verifications, Holmes said, each arising from a different aspect of the case, each pointing to the same architect. The predated submission ties the placement of the document to someone with access to the Lincoln's Inn chambers outside the formal submission process. The poison's source ties the method of Fortescue's death to someone with authorised access to legal evidence storage, and Hargreaves's professional history, as established by my inquiry agent, provides the precedent. 3 prior cases with the same structural fingerprint. He paused at the curb. What I have been assembling, Watson, is not merely evidence of what was done. I have been assembling evidence of how it was done. A jury may convict upon motive and opportunity. A judge will convict upon mechanism, and mechanism is what, until today, I did not entirely possess. Then we go to Lestrade. Tomorrow morning, Holmes said. Tonight I want to reconstruct the full timeline in writing. The sequence from Gerald Vane's death through the statement's preparation and placement, through Fortescue's letter to Hargreaves, through the poisoning, through the manufacture of Geddes' confession, each event in its proper order, each connected to the next by a demonstrable link. He raised his hand for a cab. Hargreaves made a fundamental error, not in the design of his scheme, which was elegant, but in its execution. He left at each stage a record, not through carelessness precisely, but through an excess of confidence in the proposition that no one would think to look at the timing of a clerk's ledger entry, or to inquire at a hospital about the preservation chemistry of an obscure alkaloid, or to ask a young man in Lincoln's Inn who had recommended him for his position. The cab arrived. Holmes held the door and looked at me across its roof with an expression of quiet, resolved certainty. He constructed a very accomplished deception, said he. He constructed it, however, upon the assumption that the people around him would see only what he arranged for them to see. That assumption, the belief that appearances, once arranged, will hold indefinitely, is the point at which elaborate schemes most reliably begin to fail. He stepped in. I followed. We rode back through the lamplit evening toward Baker Street, and I thought, not for the first time in Holmes's company, how very much depended upon the willingness of one man to look, without assumption, at the thing directly in front of him. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Mask. Holmes spent the better part of that evening at his desk. I sat across from him with a book I made indifferent progress through, occasionally refilling my pipe and watching, without appearing to watch, the quiet industry of the man opposite. He wrote steadily and without visible hesitation, the scratch of his pen the only sound beyond the fire, pausing only to consult his pile of documents, or to sit for a moment with his eyes closed in the manner of a man checking a piece of mental arithmetic before committing it to paper. By 11 o'clock he'd covered some 12 pages in his close, precise hand, and had arranged them in a sequence he weighted at the corners with a brass paperweight, a revolver, and 2 volumes of the Criminal Index. He read the completed sequence through once, made 2 small amendments, and set it aside. "Watson," said he without looking up, "I shall want you to be present tomorrow morning, and I think perhaps Lestrade ought to be there as well, not for the drama of it, but because what is established in that room will need to be actionable from the moment it's spoken." "Where?" I asked. "Hargreaves's office. I have already sent a note requesting his presence at 10 o'clock, on the grounds that I have intelligence bearing upon the suspended Vane proceedings which he, as solicitor of record, ought to hear directly." He finally looked up, and the expression on his face was the composed, settled look of a man who has discharged the preparatory work and is ready for whatever the field may require. "I have also sent word to Pembroke and to Miss Vane. She has a right to hear this. Lestrade met us outside the building in Chancery Lane at 5 minutes to 10. He was in the best professional humour I had observed from him in the course of this affair. The ledger entry from Rees, received the previous evening as Holmes had arranged, had evidently produced in him a material reassessment of the situation. He greeted Holmes with something closer to genuine collegial respect than the wary deference he more commonly managed. "The submission discrepancy," said he. 2 days. I had the ledger and the receipt compared by 2 separate officers last night." "Good," said Holmes simply. "Stay close and say very little until I have concluded. After that you may say as much as you like." Hargreaves's office was arranged as I had observed on our first visit, yet with the deliberate gravity of a practice built to inspire confidence. He received us in the inner room. He, Holmes, Watson, Lestrade, Pembroke, and Miss Vane, the last seated somewhat apart from the others, her face composed with an effort I could see clearly from where I stood. Hargreaves himself was behind his desk, and he managed the entrance of a police inspector with a smooth professional equanimity that I found, knowing what I now knew, frankly admirable in its technical execution. "A considerable gathering," said he. "I confess I had not expected quite so formal an assembly, Mr. Holmes." "Formality seemed appropriate," Holmes replied, taking the chair directly opposite, "given that what I have to set before you concerns not merely the civil proceedings, but a murder." The word fell into the room and settled there. Pembroke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Vane's hands in her lap went very still. Hargreaves's expression did not change, which was itself, I thought, the most revealing response in the room. "A very serious allegation," said Hargreaves. "A very serious demonstration," Holmes corrected. He did not raise his voice, and he did not produce any document or prop. He simply looked at Hargreaves across the desk, with the steady attention of a man who has been moving toward this moment for some days and finds, now that it has arrived, that it requires nothing theatrical. He began with the statement. He laid out, in precise and unhurried sequence, the analysis of the handwriting, the continental cursive beneath the imitated English form, the pattern of inconsistency that emerged under the cognitive demand of complex syntax, or he moved to the fabricated identity, the absence of Elias Crow from every registry, directory, and official record, and the correspondence with a known continental practitioner of documentary fraud, whose method the construction of Crow's identity matched in every particular. He moved to the ledger entry. He explained the 2-day discrepancy between the date on which Rees had received and logged the document and the date on which Crow had appeared to execute the submission receipt. He noted that Rees had been appointed to his position 8 months prior to the submission, upon a recommendation made by Hargreaves, not as evidence of Rees's involvement, but as evidence of advance preparation. The document had been placed in the office before its supposed delivery. Someone with access to the chambers had placed it. He moved to the poison. He traced the compound identified in the laboratory report through its source: legal evidence storage, accessible only to persons of sufficient professional standing, engaged with relevant proceedings. He established the physical access, the professional qualification, the prior letter from Fortescue to Hargreaves that had made the magistrate's growing suspicion known to the one person with both motive and means to act upon it. Throughout this recitation, Hargreaves sat with the stillness of a man who has made a private decision about how to occupy himself during the interval between the inevitable and its formal arrival. He folded his hands upon the desk. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. The confession from Geddes, Holmes continued, was the final element, designed to redirect the investigation toward Miss Vane before the timeline discrepancy could be discovered and before the chemistry of the teacup residue had been properly examined. Geddes was a former employee, dismissed 3 weeks ago, which provides the period within which pressure or inducement might be applied, and his statement contained the forensic signatures of a composed rather than a spontaneous document. Professional paper, consistent emotional register, a suspiciously precise figure for the bribe allegedly paid. Holmes paused for a single measured beat. And, most revealingly, no answer to the question of how Miss Vane's supposed intermediary would have known to approach a junior clerk in Hargreaves's own chambers. He stopped. The room was very quiet. "The answer to that question," said Holmes, "is that no intermediary approached Geddes on Miss Vane's behalf because Miss Vane had no intermediary and no scheme. The person who knew that Geddes possessed the relevant contacts and might be made use of was the person who had employed Geddes for 3 years and had then dismissed him under sufficient pressure to make him tractable." Hargreaves looked at Holmes for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate composure of a man who has decided that a certain manner costs nothing more than any other, he said, "This is an impressive construction, Mr. Holmes. I wonder whether it is sufficiently robust to stand before a jury." "It is robust enough to stand before one at the Bailey," Lestrade said, from behind Holmes's right shoulder, "which is where it will be presented. Mr. Hargreaves, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Mr. Samuel Fortescue and the procurement of a false witness statement in the matter of the Vane estate." Hargreaves received this without visible agitation. He stood, straightened his coat, and looked briefly at Holmes before looking away again. Not, I thought, from guilt, but from the particular distaste of a man who finds it disagreeable to have been understood. Holmes spoke once more, quietly, before Lestrade guided Hargreaves toward the door. "You are a man of considerable intelligence," said he. "The scheme you constructed was, in its design, genuinely accomplished. The false identity, the planted statement, the managed timeline, the manufactured confession, each element was well conceived. Your error was not in the lie. It was in believing that the lie need not be lived convincingly. The people around you, Rees, Miss Vane, and Fortescue himself, were honest, observant, and particular in their habits. You assumed those qualities would render them manageable. In fact, they rendered them accurate. Their records, their instincts, and their memories preserved the truth you needed them to overlook." Hargreaves said nothing. He went with Lestrade without resistance, and the door closed behind them with the quiet, substantial sound of a well-made thing returning to its resting position. The room exhaled around its remaining occupants. Pembroke stood with his hands at his sides in the attitude of a man who has witnessed something he will spend some time absorbing. Miss Vane remained in her chair, and I looked at her, as I'd looked at her hands throughout the preceding half-hour, not from clinical habit now, but from simple human concern. She was weeping quietly, without apparent self-consciousness. The specific tears, I thought, of a person in whom a sustained and nameless dread has finally been given a name and, in being named, has begun to release its grip. I moved to sit near her and said nothing, because there was, at that moment, nothing that needed to be said. Holmes stood at the window and looked out at Chancery Lane with his hands in his coat pockets, and if he was moved by what had passed in the room behind him, he gave no outward sign of it beyond remaining still for rather longer than his usual restlessness permitted. Chapter 10. The Restoration of Truth. The weeks that followed the arrest of Mr. Hargreaves moved with the particular measured pace of legal proceedings, that deliberate institutional rhythm which bears no relation to the urgency of the human lives it governs. I shall not burden the reader with the procedural details, which were, in the manner of such things, both numerous and tedious in isolation, however consequential in their accumulated effect. What matters, and what I record here for completeness, is that the mechanism Holmes had assembled with such care proved, before the relevant authorities, as durable as he had assured Lestrade it would be. The ledger entry discrepancy, confirmed by independent examination, established that the Crow statement had been placed in the Lincoln's Inn chambers in advance of its supposed delivery. Hargreaves's access to the building during the relevant period was established through the visitor logs, which he had signed on a day he had not mentioned in any of his interviews with the police, a Tuesday, 3 days before Crow's appearance. The purpose of his visit recorded as a consultation on an unrelated matter that the chambers could find no corresponding record of. The alkaloid compound in Fortescue's teacup was traced, through the evidence storage logs, to a case file to which Hargreaves had been granted access in his professional capacity 4 months previously. The log entry had been made and could not be unmade, and it placed him in physical proximity to the compound during the period in which, the chemists established, a quantity sufficient for the magistrate's dose must have been removed. Thomas Geddes, confronted with the full weight of what had been assembled and advised by his own counsel that the alternative to cooperation was an accessory charge of considerable gravity, provided a statement of a very different character from the one he delivered to Scotland Yard. This one was composed at 2 a.m, in his own lodgings, on paper of entirely ordinary quality, in a hand that showed every sign of emotional agitation. It confirmed that Hargreaves had dismissed him 3 weeks prior to the confession, not for differences of professional opinion, as Geddes had first maintained, but because Geddes had observed something in the chambers that Hargreaves had not intended him to see. The precise nature of that observation Geddes had not understood at the time. He understood it rather better in retrospect. Hargreaves had then approached him with an arrangement, the confession implicating Miss Vane, in exchange for a sum of money and the assurance that his own liability would remain limited. Geddes, frightened and in need of funds, had accepted. He was released. The charges against him were not pursued beyond a formal caution, a leniency that Lestrade communicated to Holmes with the air of a man extending a professional courtesy he feels he has earned the right to extend. Miss Vane's name was cleared by formal order of the court, before which the civil proceedings resumed, some 5 weeks after Hargreaves's arrest. Pembroke managed the restored case with the composed efficiency of a man who has been given back a brief he had never expected to see again in a presentable condition, and the matter was concluded on its legal merits in her favour. I did not attend the final sitting. Such proceedings are not, in my experience, improved by an audience beyond those strictly required. But Pembroke sent a note to Baker Street that afternoon, brief and warmly worded, which Holmes read, folded, and placed in the top drawer of his desk with an economy of gesture that I had come to understand after long acquaintance as his equivalent of a more expressive man's smile. I called upon Miss Vane once during this period, not on any professional errand, but simply because I wished to satisfy myself that she was well and that the restoration of her legal position had been accompanied by at least the beginning of a more general restoration. I found her considerably altered from the drawn, carefully composed woman of our earlier visits. Not ebullient, for she was not a person given to ebullience, but quieter in a different way. The watchful, unnamed tension that had communicated itself through the tightening of her hands was gone. She spoke of her uncle with the natural, uncomplicated grief of a person who's been permitted to mourn without the additional burden of suspicion, and she thanked me with a directness and simplicity that I found, if I'm honest, rather affecting. She didn't ask after Holmes specifically, though she sent him a brief formal note of thanks that he acknowledged with equal formality by return. I thought this suited them both. It was on an evening some 3 weeks after the conclusion of the case that Holmes and I sat once more in the Baker Street sitting room in the attitude that had by then become so familiar as to feel, in the best sense, inevitable. Holmes in his chair by the cold hearth, myself opposite, the room in its customary state of companionable disorder. The case had been succeeded by 2 others of no great complexity, and Holmes was between occupations, which meant he was at his most reflective, and in consequence his most conversational. I had been setting down my notes on the Vane affair. I kept such notes habitually, with a view to the record if nothing else. And I looked up from my writing to find him watching the middle distance with the thoughtful repose that distinguished his genuine contemplations from his performed ones. It was a crime of precision, I said, half to him and half to the notes before me. Not passion, not opportunism. Every element was prepared. The forger engaged months in advance, the clerk placed in position, the timeline managed, the confession arranged as a contingency. It requires a particular kind of mind. It requires a mind that understands institutional process, Holmes replied, and trusts implicitly in the power of appearance. Hargreaves's entire professional life was built upon the management of appearances, the solid office, the unimpeachable reputation, the decades of conspicuous reliability. These were not incidental to his character. They were his method. A man who has spent 30 years building an appearance of absolute trustworthiness comes eventually to believe that the appearance is sufficient, that it will bear any weight placed upon it. I set down my pen. He underestimated the people around him. He made the more fundamental error of not truly seeing them. He saw Rees as a manageable instrument, placed and relied upon like a piece of well-maintained equipment. He did not see that Rees was a conscientious young man for whom the accuracy of a ledger entry was a matter of personal professional pride. He saw Fortescue as an obstacle to be removed once the magistrate's suspicion was confirmed, without considering that the act of removal would itself require explanation. He saw Miss Vane as a convenient suspect, her financial motive obvious, her position vulnerable, without accounting for the possibility that someone might look at her grief and find it genuine rather than performed. Holmes leaned back and looked up at the ceiling with the expression of a man reaching for a formulation he has been turning over for some time. In a world governed by appearances, Watson, the most dangerous man is he who understands how they are made. He constructs them with facility, inhabits them with confidence, and navigates among them with the assurance of a native. But that very facility becomes his limitation. He can no longer see past the surface to the substance, because for him, the surface has long since become the whole of the thing. I thought about this for a moment. And you, I said, see past the surface. I see the surface for what it is, Holmes said, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a man making a simple technical distinction, which is not the same as ignoring it. The surface is informative, enormously so, but it is informative precisely because it is a surface, and surfaces have edges, seams, inconsistencies. The trick is not to look through them, but to look at them very carefully indeed. He fell silent. The fire settled in the grate. From somewhere below came the faint domestic sound of Mrs. Hudson concluding her evening arrangements with her customary thoroughness. I returned to my notes and wrote for a time, and the room was quiet around us in the companionable way it had when neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with anything beyond our own respective thoughts. Presently I set the pen down again, not because I had finished, but because I found myself looking at what I had written and feeling, with the particular satisfaction that occasionally attends the completion of something, that it was enough. The case was closed. Its silence at last was broken. not by confession, not by accident, but by the patient, disciplined willingness of one man to attend to the precise texture of the world as he found it, and to trust that the truth, however carefully concealed, would eventually declare itself to those with sufficient care and honesty to look. Miss Vane was exonerated. Geddes was released. Hargreaves would face the judgment of 12 of his fellow citizens in due course, and on evidence that would not permit of comfortable alternatives. And Holmes sat in his chair by the dying fire, already, I suspected, more than half elsewhere, his thoughts ranging forward into whatever the next case might bring, restless as ever, brilliant as ever, and in his element as only a man entirely suited to his occupation can ever truly be. I closed my notebook, put down my pen, and was content.